They didn't just want your land. They wanted your fear, your dignity, and your very identity erased. This was an empire that made cruelty a public performance, where flayed skins fluttered from city gates, severed heads formed pyramids in the streets, and starving cities devoured themselves under endless siege. Defeated kings were paraded like chained animals, entire nations vanished into forced exile, and every act of horror was carved into stone so no one could ever pretend it hadn't happened. The Assyrians didn't hide their atrocities. They advertised them, and what they left behind was not just a conquered world, but a legacy of terror so profound that, thousands of years later, their name still drips with blood. 1. Welcome to the original House of Horrors. Long before modern dictators learned the art of terror, the Assyrian Empire perfected it, turning cruelty into a national brand. This was not random violence. It was a calculated system, engineered to make resistance seem suicidal. From the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrians didn't just conquer lands. They crushed souls. Their brutality wasn't whispered about in dark corners. It was carved in stone on palace walls for all to see. Imagine walking into a king's throne room and seeing an entire mural of him personally driving a spear through a prisoner's throat, or peeling the skin off an enemy alive, with captions boasting of his mercy for letting the victim live a few moments longer. To the Assyrians, horror was a weapon. Every flaying, every mass impalement, every tower of severed heads was a press release in blood. They made sure news of their atrocities traveled faster than their armies. By the time their chariots appeared on the horizon, cities often opened their gates without a fight, because everyone knew what happened to those who didn't. This was an empire where public executions were stage-managed like grand ceremonies, where conquered kings were chained like animals for court entertainment, and where children were marched into exile to erase their culture forever. In a world of brutal, ancient powers, the Assyrians stood alone as the undisputed architects of fear. Their empire was less a kingdom and more a factory of nightmares, mass-producing death and humiliation on a scale the ancient world had never seen. Welcome to the original House of Horrors. A place where cruelty wasn't the side effect of conquest. It was the point. 2. Psychological warfare. Fear before the first arrow. The Assyrians understood something most ancient empires didn't. You don't always need to fight to win. Sometimes, fear is cheaper than war. Before their armies even arrived, Assyrian messengers and envoys traveled ahead, spreading tales of cities burned to ash, rebels flayed alive, and captives chained together like livestock for thousand-mile death marches. These were not idle boasts, they were promises. Royal inscriptions and clay tablets carried explicit threats to any city foolish enough to resist. Those who defy me will have their skins hung on their walls. Their children will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. These words weren't written in secret. They were carved into stone stelae and planted at city gates, psychological landmines meant to break morale before a single arrow was loosed. This campaign of fear was so effective that entire cities surrendered without a fight, begging for mercy they rarely received. The Assyrians cultivated their reputation like a brand, ensuring that every survivor who escaped their grasp became an unwilling propaganda agent. Refugees carried the horror stories farther than any marching soldier could. Even their art was a weapon. Palace walls showed kings grasping enemy rulers by the jaw, their eyes wide with terror, just moments before execution. These reliefs were meant to be seen not just by subjects, but by visiting envoys, a silent warning of what awaited any who defied Assyrian rule. The result was an empire where the sound of Assyrian hoofbeats could empty a city before the first spear was raised. They didn't just fight wars, they won them in the minds of their enemies first. Third siege tactics that starved cities into cannibalism. When fear alone didn't break a city, the Assyrians turned to a slower, more merciless weapon: the siege. They were masters of cutting a city off from the world, surrounding it with troops and siege engines, blocking every road, river, and hidden path. Food stopped coming in. Water sources were seized or poisoned. Time became the real killer. The Assyrians had the patience of predators. They could sit outside a city for months, even years, watching hunger hollow out their enemies. Grain stores emptied, wells ran dry, and desperation took hold. Ancient accounts speak of civilians reduced to eating leather, grass, and eventually each other. Cannibalism wasn't just a rumor, it was the endgame. Sometimes they accelerated the process by capturing nearby farmland, burning crops, and killing livestock so that no one inside could hope for relief. They even launched occasional probing attacks, just to force defenders to expend precious food and water in the chaos. The psychological toll was crushing. Starving parents threw their children over the walls, hoping the enemy would feed them. Soldiers deserted their posts in search of food, only to be cut down by waiting Assyrian cavalry. Eventually the gates would open, not in a show of strength, but in surrender to escape the nightmare within. But surrender was no guarantee of mercy. Often the Assyrians entered with full force, executing leaders, enslaving survivors, and leaving the city an empty husk. For them, the siege was not just a military tactic. It was a slow-motion massacre, a calculated breaking of both body and spirit. 4. Public executions as political theater. When the Assyrians took a city, they didn't just kill, they staged death like a grand performance. Executions were public, deliberate, and meant to burn themselves into the memory of every survivor. Entire populations were marched to central squares, forced to watch as their leaders were tortured and killed. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile, it was fatal in the most spectacular way possible. Thousands could die in a single day. Prisoners were beheaded in assembly line fashion, their severed heads stacked into neat, grotesque pyramids beside the city gates. Others were impaled alive on massive wooden stakes, their bodies slowly sliding down under their own weight. A death that could last hours. These rows of impaled victims became living billboards of terror, visible for miles. The most prestigious victims, usually captured kings or generals, were reserved for the ultimate spectacle, flaying. Stripped naked, tied down, and skinned while still alive, their screams became part of the performance. The flayed skins would later be displayed on palace walls or city gates as permanent trophies of conquest. These events weren't chaotic massacres. They were choreographed to make an example. Soldiers stood in precise formation, the crowd was controlled, and the executions unfolded like acts in a play. Except here, the curtain never fell, and the actors never left the stage alive. By turning mass killing into a political event, the Assyrians ensured that their rule wasn't just feared, it was unforgettable. 5. Flaying and skin walls. Of all Assyrian punishments, none was more feared than flaying. This was not a quick death. It was a calculated act of pain and humiliation designed to strip away not just flesh, but dignity. Captives, often high-ranking leaders or rebellious governors, were tied spread-eagle against wooden frames. Knives made the first cuts at the limbs or torso, and strips of skin were pulled away in long, agonizing ribbons. Executioners were skilled enough to keep victims alive for much of the process. Once dead, the horror continued. The skins were treated, dried, and displayed like banners. Some were nailed directly onto the gates of the city that had dared to resist, a grotesque welcome sign for anyone entering. Others were stretched across palace walls, forming a literal gallery of human trophies. The Assyrians carved inscriptions beside these displays, boasting of the victims' crimes and the king's justice. This was not done in secret. The practice was immortalized in Assyrian reliefs, where kings are depicted overseeing the process, standing proudly as executioners worked. These images served as a visual propaganda, proof that defiance would not just cost lives, but obliterate the very memory of resistance. The skin walls weren't simply morbid trophies. They were part of the empire's psychological warfare. Every time a traveler or visiting envoy saw them, they carried the story to their own lands. In this way, a single act of flaying could conquer cities the Assyrian army had yet to reach. 6. Deportations on a massive scale. For the Assyrians, conquest didn't end with victory on the battlefield. It continued with the systematic erasure of conquered peoples. One of their most effective tools was mass deportation. Entire populations, sometimes tens of thousands at a time, were uprooted from their homes and marched across hundreds of miles to distant corners of the empire. This was not random displacement. It was deliberate population engineering. Skilled workers were moved to cities where their talents could serve the Assyrian state. Farmers were resettled in fertile but politically loyal regions. Former soldiers were scattered in small numbers so they could never regroup. The logistics were staggering. Caravans stretched for miles, guarded by armed troops to prevent escape. Food and water were rationed, and many died along the way. Those who survived often found themselves in lands where they didn't speak the language, couldn't practice their religion, and were surrounded by strangers. This served two purposes. It punished rebellion by tearing people from their homeland, and it prevented uprisings by destroying cultural unity. Over time, displaced groups blended into their new surroundings, their original identity lost. The Assyrians proudly recorded these deportations in their royal inscriptions, presenting them as acts of benevolent rule, repopulating empty lands or bringing prosperity to new regions. In reality, they were dismantling nations without a single sword strike, leaving behind ghost cities and a scattered, broken populace. 7. Ritualized torture of royal prisoners. When the Assyrians captured enemy kings or nobles, they didn't simply kill them, they dismantled them piece by piece in public view. These were not hasty executions, they were ceremonies of domination. Captured rulers were paraded through the streets in chains, often naked, their regal ornaments replaced with dog collars or ropes through their lips. Crowds were encouraged to jeer, spit, and throw refuse, turning the once feared monarch into a living spectacle of humiliation. Some were forced to carry heavy yokes or drag Assyrian chariots like beasts of burden. Others were made to kneel and kiss the feet of the Assyrian king before an assembled court. In certain cases, the prisoners served as living trophies, kept in the palace like exotic animals, brought out only to amuse guests or remind subjects of Assyrian supremacy. When the time for execution came, the method matched the crime. Rebellion was answered with flaying, treachery with impalement, defiance with dismemberment. All of it was done in ceremonial order, overseen by priests and officials to ensure the symbolism was preserved. The victim's death was not just punishment. It was theater, designed to reaffirm that no crown but the Assyrian kings would ever stand. 8. The propaganda machine, carving cruelty in stone. The Assyrians didn't just commit atrocities, they turned them into permanent art. Palace walls were covered with massive stone reliefs showing every detail of conquest, cities burning, prisoners kneeling, and kings personally executing captives. These were not abstract symbols. The scenes were literal, almost cinematic in their realism. In these carvings, Assyrian kings are shown plunging spears into enemies, holding severed heads aloft, or overseeing mass deportations. Every muscle, every drop of blood, every look of terror was chiseled into stone with obsessive precision. Inscriptions boasted of exact body counts, lists of captured cities, and the number of enemies impaled or skinned. These works decorated throne rooms, reception halls, and gateways. The first thing visiting envoys would see. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who defy us. Even the floors were inlaid with inscriptions of conquest, forcing visitors to walk over the names of defeated kings. This propaganda served a dual purpose. At home, it glorified the king as chosen by the gods to bring order through force. Abroad, it was a silent, immovable threat. A history lesson carved into the very bones of the palace, impossible to ignore. 9. Religious justification for atrocities. To the Assyrians, war wasn't just politics. It was divine mandate. Their god Ashur was not a passive deity. He was a warlord, and the king was his earthly general. Every campaign was framed as a holy mission, every act of brutality as sacred justice. Royal inscriptions regularly claimed that Ashur commanded the king to destroy the wicked and spread the rule of the righteous, meaning Assyrian rule. Mass executions, flayings, and deportations were presented as offerings to the gods, cleansing the land of those who opposed divine order. Priests blessed weapons before battle, and sacrifices were made to ensure victory. Afterward, the slaughter itself was celebrated in temples. Skins of defeated rulers might be hung near shrines, their deaths framed as religious triumphs. Captives could be forced to carry temple materials as both humiliation and holy service. This divine framing made resistance not only dangerous, but blasphemous. To rebel against the Assyrian king was to rebel against Ashur himself, a crime punishable not just by death, but eternal damnation. In this way, the empire fused religion and terror into a single, unbreakable chain of control. The legacy of terror. How fear outlived the empire. When the Assyrian Empire finally fell in 612 BCE, it wasn't because their enemies forgot their cruelty. It was because they could no longer withstand the coalitions that their brutality inspired. Yet even in defeat, their name remained a byword for terror. Centuries later, biblical texts still spoke of the Assyrians as the archetype of ruthless conquerors. Neighboring kingdoms told stories of their sieges, their impalements, their endless deportations. Parents used their name to frighten children into obedience. More importantly, their methods lived on. Future empires, from Babylon to Rome, borrowed Assyrian tactics, public executions, mass deportations, terror as a prelude to conquest. They had shown the ancient world that fear could be as powerful as armies, and that cruelty, if done with enough spectacle, could outlast the conqueror himself. The Assyrian Empire may have crumbled, but the shadow it cast stretched across centuries, in stone reliefs, in scorched cities, in the whispered histories of their victims. The echo of their terror never truly faded.